Hey everyone. We're going to give everyone a second to jump in before we start the discussion, but wanted to thank you for showing up again this week for the Responsive Weekly. We really appreciate everyone showing up week after week to really give your thoughts and make this conversation richer and more helpful for everybody. Also wanted to say that there may or may not be a special guest popping in. We got our schedules a little bit mixed up, so if somebody pops in the middle, it was expected. But if they don't, then that's fine. We're going to have this discussion just with us anyway. But as a reminder, I'm Mckenna, and this is Noah, and we're part of the team at Virtuous here. And this week on the Responsive Weekly, one of the things that we really wanted to highlight is this really passionate debate that people are having about community-centric fundraising and donor-centric fundraising, and what is the best moving forward. And I think what was most important for us to add to the conversation is that we don't see any choices for your nonprofit as either or. It's really important to, I just want to make sure, am I frozen? Can anybody say in the chat, can you guys still hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Valerie. So what we wanted to say was that most of the time, both and is going to be the best answer for moving forward. We are seeing that people are, people have unique experiences, they have unique reasons for wanting to support your nonprofit, and those need to be acknowledged and considered as you're creating these fundraising strategies and systems. Noah, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's true. I think it's always about kind of like, how can we best and uniquely serve the supporters and the constituents and the beneficiaries, and how do we bridge that gap? What are the strategies we should entail or we should leverage? How should we think about building those systems to, again, just connect supporters to the story of the impact that we're doing? I think one thing that's so interesting, and I was reminded of this morning, is that change is extremely challenging, but change is what leads causes forward every single day. And it's the work that you all do, and so many of our customers here at Virtuous, and so many more in the broader ecosystem. And it's that challenge, really going after those challenges, which is what we are required to do daily to be able to effectively fund these change efforts. And I think that requires, like Mckenna said, a broader set of questions to make sure that we're thinking about that in the right way.
So we wanted to open it up to anyone who's here who is sort of tackling this whole conversation in general, but trying to think about how to move forward, and what are the things that you're finding challenging? What are the sort of consistent themes that come up as you're talking to your teams about how you're going to approach fundraising in the future? I know specifically a lot of the context around the appeals is going to be different just in the year that we've had. And so these are really important questions to think about and to discuss, and maybe get some input from everybody else on the call. So if you have those questions, as always, drop them in either the chat or the Q&A. If you want to tell a story or add more context to what you're trying to tackle, we can always add you as a speaker if you want to share that way too. Let's see. As those start to roll in, Noah, I know that you've had some experience on both sides in nonprofits themselves, and you're obviously a really successful consultant and just part of the nonprofit tech industry. What are some of the themes that you see that people have challenges with as they try to adopt change, as they try to implement change, sort of across teams, across maybe silos that exist or departments?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to something you and Gabe both put like into the book, is at the end of the day, giving, and the work that we all do, like giving of our time, giving of our money, giving of whatever resources we're using or trying to raise for our causes, is like a deeply personal act. I was talking to a bunch of at the Changemakers conference this morning, and we talked about this idea. I was telling my personal story where I met this little boy named Francis in Uganda. We were able to be invited into his home and be able to connect. And that experience of hospitality, in the same way that my mom had hospitality to guests and others, reminds us of kind of the humanity of that, and that it's not us serving them or them serving us or a donor coming in and saving the day. It's about us coming together to kind of move change forward. And I think keeping that in mind is challenging when we think about the day-to-day task, but it's not one person saving the other or us catering to one person so that they can serve the others. It's rather about bridging this connection. Like, how do we connect supporters with the story so change can move forward? And the challenge of that is that requires you to ask different questions and layers of questions. And that is the toughest part. But one thing that what I've realized is that if we can humanize the fundraising process and realize that people are giving for specific reasons and integrate that into everything we do. This morning I shared an example of an organization called WOTC, which invites people to be a part of providing universal healthcare to the most vulnerable people around the world. And what they do is they don't just invite people generically to do that. They've personalized that communication in a way that bridges that gap between the person that's receiving the care and the person that's stepping in to help fund that. But at the end of the day, both people are moving. Like, it's a communal thing. It's a action oriented thing. But what they did was they said, not just, hey, donor, do you want to help us fund healthcare in a Guatemalan hospital? But they said, hey, you supported and provide support for a child named Estella. And Estella is a part of Peter's hospital. Peter wants to send a thank you note for being a part of that ability to make that happen. And so there's a lot of people involved in that process to make that happen, that success story happen, where Estella was able to receive the care. Peter delivered the care. Kyle, the donor, actually was able to fund and help provide that care in community with other supporters. But then they kind of came back and said, not, hey, you should just give to this. But they said, hey, do you want to support more patients like Estella at Peter's hospital? Like, do you want to come together in partnership with us and Peter and the team at that hospital in Guatemala and help make a bigger difference? And I think that slight difference, it was a Valentine's Day ask, like it was an email that you would normally send out as a fundraiser. They were able to take this different approach where they're personalizing to the donor, but they're not they're not marginalizing the beneficiary or the others involved. And I think that layer of like complexity, even though it's nuanced, is what's really, really challenging to get right. But there's tons of success stories where people are doing this really well by both being conscious of the donor and being responsive to that, while also being responsive to the needs, and then being a steward of those two things to bring those together.
Yeah, what you hit on for me that makes a lot of sense, that it's also maybe something that I'm thinking about because we've been talking about it on our team, is the specificity of that. We've seen it happen. I know a couple weeks ago when we were talking about how volunteering hours were up, and people knowing that my favorite spot down the street is being affected and I want to help them because I care about that thing. That's much easier to incite action around when you are specific about, this is where your dollar is going, this is what you care about most, this is what you have historically been able to affect in terms of change in the past, and this is what we're going to do moving forward. And I think sometimes we can tend to like get right to the point and get right to the ask. And I think that development of that story and really adding those specific details can be very helpful in conversion. So while upfront it may be sort of a bigger workload, what you're doing is making it more compelling and more successful on the back end.
Yeah, and I don't think you fall into this trap of using creative liberties in the wrong way. I think this is something fundraisers have to be cautious on, is overgeneralizing, which actually then removes the humanity of the work. And so like being there's truth, and then there's I think you and I talked about this, there's like truthiness or something like that. I use this weird word, but it's like what we're saying is not untrue, but there is a truthierness or like truthier version of this story. How do we get into the specifics of that? And I think that WOTC example is perfect because they're not coloring the circumstances. They're saying like, we believe in this, we're coming together to make this happen. They're acknowledging the personal and kind of the interest and the signals from the donor and what they care about. And they're acknowledging kind of the humanity of the work that they're doing and making sure that connection happens. And I think that's what we have to be really good stewards with fundraising, whether we're doing, like whether we go down the path of serving donors more specifically, and that's like a lot of fundraisers spend the majority of their time with donors, and they're trying to connect donors or pull donors in and activate them to, you know, to point resources in a way that moves the cause forward. But I think it's making sure that we maintain that like truthiness or whatever it's called throughout that entire process is really essential.
I agree. And I think also that comes from what you're talking about, which is constant communication and that constant engagement throughout the year. Even if you don't have anything like specific to ask for or specific to report, it's still good to check in, whether it's, you know, a DM on a social media platform or a call or just an email to check in. Those points of interaction throughout the year can really help add detail, illuminate the motivations, illuminate like what they want to hear when you're actually making those appeals. So those details are much easier to find if you have that conversation throughout.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like in this week's Responsive Weekly, you kind of talked about this idea that regardless of what you call something and the approach that we take, we have to admit that like what we're doing now isn't necessarily working. And so how do we improve that? And I feel like the conversation should be less about what does that finality look like, or look like on the edges of, okay, well, if we're fully realized, this is what this would look like. And, you know, it's down to the practical and pragmatic things, like what are the steps you can take today? What are you going to do today to make sure that we're orienting in the right way to best serve our constituents and those that, and the beneficiaries of our work and those that we're serving to kind of care for bigger and broader. But then also, how do we connect donors to that? And how do you just have that like responsive mindset? I think that's why we always go back to the responsive framework. And in the book, I think I have a copy right here. And if anyone, I don't have a, oh, it's right here. I have a copy right here. If anyone doesn't have a copy, just let us know in the chat and I will get you a copy of this book that Mckenna and Gabe wrote. We talk about these like mindsets, and maybe that's something that was interesting. Maybe you could talk about that, Mckenna, some of the mindsets of a responsive nonprofit, or some of the key things to keep in mind. Because I think those are the practical things that are going to like show up every day in your day-to-day work. And that's why we tried to, or like, I appreciated you all including that in the book that we put together.
Sure. I think, you know, the main thing is to lead with listening. Of course, everyone here, and we're all experts on our organization and the job that we do, but what we don't know is the motivations of each of our donors and how those evolve and change throughout the year, throughout the years that they are part of your community. And I think that leading with listening, making sure that you're taking in that data and comparing it against historical data, comparing it against what we know sort of globally in the way that people respond to communications and respond to appeals and things like that. Always listening first is kind of the best mindset to adopt first, because that will give you sort of the next step forward. And then you can pick from different philosophies, different processes, different systems, what works for you and what works for the people that you're trying to connect with. Because I think, kind of like you said, when you decide where you're going before you start out on that path, you may end up in a place that is not helpful for anybody. So if you just take the first step first, that's really easy and helpful to get forward.
Yeah. And Jason Lewis, who is going to join us, he runs responsivefundraising.com, which is a consultancy. One thing that he talks about is that we've almost over prioritized efficiency and this full force pledge to efficiency. And efficiency requires predictability. And so we have systems and we optimize them to be efficient, which requires predictability. And in a world like 2020 and just going forward and just kind of the complexities of human nature and kind of the nuances of that doesn't really lend itself well to predictability. And so in the pursuit of efficiency, we actually create kind of mirages of predictability when that's not necessarily true. And so his push is that instead of optimizing for efficiency, we should really push into a posture of exploration, which does require that sense of humility that we're going to go on this journey not knowing exactly how we're going to get there and where we're going to go exactly, and kind of the like how long it's going to take us. I've been watching, I don't know if anyone else is, if you have, drop it in the chat, but I've been watching The World's Toughest Race on Amazon Prime. That thing is intense, by the way. But one thing that's interesting is there's this general goal, like they have to get to this like one point after 8 to 11 days of traveling through the Fiji jungle. But they're going all over the place, ups and downs. They run into obstacles. People get hurt. The rain comes in. There was a tropical storm. Like there's all these factors that kind of come at them throughout that race. So they know what they're trying to accomplish. But what they did was they had to prepare for years, some of them like a decade, for this race, not because of they knew the course and they're just optimizing for the course, but rather for all the unpredictability. And so what I've been fascinated by is listening to some of their stories and even digging into them further on the level of resilience that they're training for. And that's really what's going to differentiate them versus a team that doesn't necessarily make it. Even though the best teams may not even make it because it's just, there's challenges there. But that resilience and willingness to explore and then adapt quickly under the foundation of listening and kind of adapting to what's going on is really, really powerful, and something I think we could learn a lot from as nonprofit leaders. And just to kind of illustrate some of that, like when I ran growth for international relief nonprofit, and some of you may have heard this story, but I think it's worth repeating. We had made a bunch of changes to how we talked about our work, and it was on the backbone of hours brainstorming in the boardroom, right? Like it's like this kind of classical thing where we all went in, we spent weeks and months and just like thinking about what we should do, how we should talk about this, how we should message this. And we made a bunch of decisions, and we removed specific nuances and key attributes of how we were talking about our work, how we were talking about our mission. And the hope was that we would be able to grow the donor base that we were able to serve, which then would allow us to have a broader impact in the world. Because at the end of the day, the reason we were trying to grow is that the program work around the world demand us to grow and think creatively on how to do this. So we had the right intentions. The challenge was that we didn't see the results after we implemented. So we spent all this time like hanging out in the boardroom, brainstorming and doing your typical like post-it note opportunities. And we pushed this message out, and like it flatlines. And it wasn't devastating, but it didn't have the results that we did. So it's kind of like we set out on this journey with this expectation that we had figured it out, like that we were ready, that we were like, we knew where we needed to go. And the challenges was within a couple steps, we realized we had no idea what the heck we were doing. And so what we turned to was just beginning to talk to supporters. And through a variety of different means, we ended up talking to about 1,100, 1,200 of our core supporters. And these were everyday donors, major donors, board members, et cetera, through surveys, through one-on-one phone calls. And what we realized, if we fuse the insights together, is that the core things that we thought we would remove to enable us to move forward were the things that held it together. And it was those specificity, like the specificity of it. We were trying to be more broad and general and talking about our work and like, you know, you can provide this, or you can help children, or you can do this. What they loved was the specificity. They loved the fact that we enabled them to get closer to the good. Like they were the giver and they wanted to be closer to the good and collaborate in partnership with our partners to make those changes happen. And we completely neutered our messaging with that specificity. And it was that insight that then we changed it. We learned tons about it. And now they're like growing, they're still growing. And they had challenges through COVID, and they still grew through because their community was resilient when they committed to being specific. And I think that was just a great example of they weren't modifying their message for the donor. In some ways, we tried to modify our message for the donor and we failed because we realized that they actually cared about what was real, not our coloring, and kind of creative liberties on what we were trying to accomplish. So I don't know if that's helpful for anybody, but it's something that's stuck through my entire career, that experience.
I think it also speaks to kind of an experience that we've had like on the Responsive Weekly specifically, where this conversation started out on Slack. I thought that it would make more sense, people would be more inclined to contribute if it wasn't an on-camera thing like a webinar, and that turned out to not work because people weren't as used to Slack. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that one thing that maybe didn't work doesn't need to be thrown away. All of that effort, all of those insights, all of that brainstorming is not wasted effort. as long as you can sort of like pivot and keep pushing forward. So that time spent thinking about different ways to serve donors, that time spent coming up with new things to try, new strategies to implement, is not time wasted, because you don't sort of have to throw the whole thing out if it doesn't work exactly how you're hoping. And that is the sort of iteration and the optimization and the taking away the fear of failure, because what you're doing is you're learning about the details and the specific things that matter to your donors each time you try something new. And you're building trust. You're saying to the people that support you most, is this something you care about? If we do this, will it sort of fuel your motivation? Will it bring you closer? And each new thing that you try, you're building trust from your constituents that you're actually trying to move forward and do great things with the ways that they contribute to your nonprofit. So I would say that is really an important takeaway, is you don't have to throw the whole thing away. You can always sort of embrace failure as a way to make the next idea better. And that's one of those sort of philosophies that we talked about in the book.
Yeah, for sure. I know we only have a few minutes left. Any comments or questions from the participants? It's a quiet bunch today. I guess it's Thursday. I guess it's always Thursday when we have these, but we do have a quiet bunch today.
And again, if anybody wants a copy of the book, just send an email. You can reply to the Responsive Weekly or send an email to Noah. He dropped his email address in the chat, and we'll get those out to you.
Yeah, looked out to everybody. Yeah. And do we have the information on the product highlight that we're doing next?
Yes. So as every week on Thursdays, right after this, we are hosting a sort of a behind the scenes look at the different features of the Virtuous platform. And I will put the link to that Zoom in the chat right now. So you can just click that link and hop over to that if you want to see some new features, some exciting things that we've released, and just get a tour of the Virtuous platform. It's right there available for you. But yeah, if there are no other questions, we will hop off and give everyone back their Thursday morning. But thank you for coming, and thank you for chatting with us.
Yeah, thanks everyone. See you later. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.